welcome back to the MoonCast. Today we are tackling one of the most confusing and important questions in Web3. How do you actually structure a DAO so it's more than just a Discord server and a multi-sig wallet? We're talking about wrappers, entity stacks, token issuers, and how to make it all work across borders. Today specifically, I am joined obviously as always with my co-host Razin Nizar, but we also have a very special guest, James Kingston, founder of DAO SPV, a platform that helps DAOs and founders set up legal entities across 13 jurisdictions. Together, we'll dive into the practical side of structuring, how to pick the right wrapper, align our token plans with that wrapper and real-world compliance, and actually get a bank or an exchange to say yes to our plans. By the end of this episode, you'll have a clear picture of what options are out here, from Cayman and Marshall Island foundations to Wyoming and Swiss associations, and how to choose the one that matches your DAO goals, governance style, and of course the fundraising plans, which is the core of many of the DAOs that gets established. With your founders and investors in place, and if you are just a DAO curious person that would like to learn better about how to proceed with your plans, this is the podcast for you. James, thank you so much for joining us today. Appreciate it. For people that don't know, this is our second take. We have some technical difficulties, so thank you for bearing with us.
My pleasure, my pleasure.
So James, can you walk us through your journey into the space? What led you to founding DAO SPV and focusing on DAO structuring?
Absolutely. So I think possibly like a lot of people in Web3, I had a slightly elliptical route to where I am now. So as my name and accent will suggest, I'm British. I'm actually originally from the Isle of Man, where my family business is company structuring, setting up international company structures for TradFi businesses all around the world. As a teenager and younger guy, I wasn't keen on that at all. I thought that sounded tedious and unimaginative. I wanted to do other things. So after graduating from uni, then getting called to the bar, I decided to work in the tech industry and worked in a variety of sales, research, product management roles, marketing roles, doing all sorts of things. As part of that, I developed a deepening interest in the kind of social, economic, and political consequences of the internet and of the internet platforms, what that was doing to our societies and our general world, what it meant for large firms to collect all this data and what was happening with that data. So I started getting, with a sort of historical, political, anthropological hat, very interested in all of that. And that led me to a deepening interest in Web3, in blockchain, all of the ideas contained therein. And then what I belatedly realized a few years ago is that actually, I could unite my background and interests in this new way, because there's this whole world of technology, but the technology does still need corporate forms. So that's what led to the path that took me into DAO SPV, where we now specialize in helping Web3 entrepreneurs set up international legal structures that can realize their Web3 ambitions, and thus, create a new and better internet in forms of collaboration and economic activity.
Wow. So this is really fantastic to learn about the evolution of your journey, starting from a family business and then heading deep into the tech world and specifically into DAOs. So before we dive deeper into this, let's give our audience a quick breakdown again of what a DAO is exactly. A DAO stands for Decentralized Autonomous Organization. So think of it like an online community that runs itself, not through a CEO or a board, but through rules written into smart contracts on the blockchain. So this is where you have the layer of transparency. So members come together around a shared goal. It could be investing, building a product, or managing a protocol. And instead of decisions being made top down, they are made collectively, usually through token-based voting. And this is where the tokens come in. And there's different types of tokens, utility tokens, governance tokens. There's also fundraising tokens, security tokens, so many different types of tokens that can attach to these DAOs. And some of them lead to this governance. But what's really DAOs all are about is digital cooperative opportunities, borderless transparency, and it's all powered by code and community rather than traditional hierarchy. So this is it in a nutshell. So I do understand why you're attracted to it from a cultural perspective. It's an evolution of human collaboration, really, if you think about it.
Yeah, yes, absolutely.
And so
creativity.
Yes, absolutely. And this is the part of it that I really like. It takes the boring legal work into something more creative, and it takes building things and investing into things to make it a bit more creative. So speaking of that, so from your perspective, what are the biggest pain points DAO SPVs help solve for founders today? What are the things that they are doing better than the traditional, formations that existed in the past?
Well, I think one is about the overall pain points of why people need legal wrappers, and the other one is about us. So what we specialize in is, because we have a Web3 focus, we understand the Web3 world, the priorities and needs of a Web3 entrepreneur. Most providers in the traditional entity formation space simply, aren't of that and, get terrified if you mention the word blockchain. And so I can see little bubbles of alarm calling around people's brains sometimes when I say this. So there's, just a pure specialism there, and then offering it up to people through a platform. So we try and make it just a bit more web-centric. On the slightly broader point, though, about why the SPVs, why the wrappers, well, there are lots of different answers to that question depending upon the use case. But if we look purely at DAOs, it really comes down at core to having a legal personality, which means that the traditional world of corporations and people off-chain, they have someone to deal with in the terms that the legal system understands, and then limited liability. So, making sure ultimately that you as a token holder or as one of the sort of main figures in the project don't get sued, don't lose your house, etc. if there's some kind of issue with the DAO.
What I gathered from this, and I think this is a really key point here, it's because you can have the original founding members of a DAO, but they cannot thrive without a community. And for community members to participate and shield themselves. So a lot of people want to participate, but maybe not as active as the founding team. They want to be more on like casual basis. So creating that DAO LLC formation behind it, putting that limited liability, makes it more palatable for the casual investor, the casual participant, instead of the people that are really putting all of their eggs on that basket. So I do get that. This is really great. It makes it much a safer space for investors and participants. Mm-hmm. With that, Razin, can you take over to the icebreaker?
Yeah. I mean, you guys have laid out very interesting topics for me. Like, I want to dive deeper into what DAO is all about, legal requirements all across the world, and, what are some of the use cases. I want to learn more about that. But before we dive deeper into that, James, we're going to do a rapid fire questions where basically just answer the good, bad, ugly, whatever that comes in your mind, and we'll start from there. All right. So the first question is, if a founder asks you, why do you need a wrapper? What is your answer in one sentence?
I would say to give you legal personality so you can pay rent, get investors, and, deal with the quote unquote real world, and limited liability. So if it all gets wrong, you don't lose your house.
Yeah, paying rent. Of course, we all have to do that. So what's the funniest thing, or what's the strangest DAO governance proposal that you've ever come across?
Well, I mean, this really is a kind of how long is a piece of string sort of question. Depends on what's funny, and there's also a hell of a lot of options. I think for me, though, some of the more interesting ones is the Constitution DAO, the guys that wanted to buy a copy of the US Constitution. I also think, if I recall, there was something around a Dune DAO where they thought they were going to buy the rights to Dune, but as I recall it, the community had fundamentally misunderstood what it was they were buying and the rights contained therein. But that didn't stop them from raising quite a few million. So yes, sometimes the energy and enthusiasm of a community can come up against some quite cold and unyielding facts of the rest of the world, and that can lead to some interesting things.
Very interesting. And between Cayman Islands, Marshall Islands, and Wyoming, if they were in a 3-way cage fight for the best DAO wrapper, who wins and why?
Well, I think this depends a lot upon the terms of the fight. Is it a bare knuckle fight? Has there been any kind of like handicapping and waiting? I envisage in this context the Cayman Islands Foundation. It's the big heavyweight bruiser. It's large. He's got a lot of kilos on him. He's sort of stomping around the cage and actually has quite a lot of people cheering him on. But the others are more nimble. They can do interesting things. They can get tangle up his feet. Maybe one interesting historical example, I'm a history nerd, is if you think of the gladiators, the guy with the sword and the heavy armor, that is the Cayman Island Foundation. But the guy with the net and the trident, that's Wyoming and Marshall Islands. They're a bit more flexible. They move around a bit more. They can sort of prod him with the trident and throw a net over things. They just have to be more imaginative at the end of the day.
I mean, that's an awesome analogy. And last question that we have, what is the most common mistake that you see teams make when they're tying their token issuance to a legal entity?
So I think it's really thinking the tokens, when you're releasing them, who you're releasing them to, what promises you made early on, what impact is that going to have on the overall token economics? And then in turn, what impact will that have upon the long-term health of your project? If you've given the initial investors a vast amount of tokens they can release whenever they want, what's that going to do to your token price? And in turn, to your ability to raise capital, get enthusiasm, find community participants, all of that kind of thing, and so on and so forth. One of the things that I've moved deeper into this space is quite how dense and rich a topic that question of getting your tokens right really is. And I feel that a lot of projects often, particularly if they're coming more from a TradFi background and believe there's an opportunity, they haven't really thought sometimes enough about that, which is a great shame because, if you're, obviously some projects are a little bit more all around hype and enthusiasm than others, and perhaps it isn't the end of the world if it collapses early on. But others, you imagine some of these deep in projects where they're really pulling together a lot of really interesting hardware, like real long-term scientific partners and physical partners, for it to go wrong because they got the token economics wrong at the beginning. It's a crying shame.
That concludes the rapid fire question. And then you mentioned about hype and blah, blah. I guess this is when we talk about the market reality, hype versus implementation. Yeah, Sanat.
Yeah, I mean, this is like the big questions of DAO. I myself have been involved in DAOs for quite a while. I started my journey with DAOs back in 2022. I mean, in crypto years, it's like dog years. Each year is like 7 years. Yes. So I remember working with the Polygon team, the Polygon V Village team, and then we created this in ETH Paris. This is the first DAO to be based in Paris by the Moulin Rouge, and we're going to have this hub for Web3 builders. They wanted to invest in real estate, so there's this big projects, and we participated in them. And what ended up really happening in most of the DAO projects that I've kind of start talking to these founders, they collapsed at the aspect of liability, as you've mentioned earlier. Everyone wants to jump into a DAO and they have these ambitious dreams, whether buying the dune rights or building a resort or buying a football club, whatever it is. But then when it comes to liability, when it comes to members feeling the sting of the law for non-compliance with specific things, whether it's let's say safety regulations, whatever, everyone starts fearing that they're going to be looped in and start abandoning these projects. So I saw a lot of DAOs go from idea and nowhere beyond idea. Very few that incorporated exactly were able to take it further. And today we know by the latest studies conducted end of last year, it shows that there's over 13,000 DAOs managing over $24.5 billion in treasury assets and 11.1 million governance token holders. So that is a huge scale, given that DAOs really did not emerge until, I would say, the early 20s at that scale. And now in 4 years, we see them reaching that magnitude. So there's obviously a hype there, but other reports say that a lot of these DAOs are opening and busting, or they call them rug pulled DAOs. So where is it really sitting, the industry today? Do you see it? Is it a lot of hype? Over-engineered hype, or is it true infrastructure genuine plays that are yet to mature?
Yes. I think there's a lot of things you could say about that. Of course, a lot of DAOs really are, to use a sort of acronym that seems to have migrated across from political life. They are DNOs, DAOs in name only. I think there's certainly a bit of a trend in that. I think sometimes that has happened for quite sort of knowing reasons on behalf of some of the participants. They want to say it's a DAO. It's never going to be, but they find it useful. Other times, I think people just have a bit of a misconception what a DAO is. They feel if they're just a bit decentralized in some vague sense, and it's a DAO. And then others, again, well, they do fully intend that it being quite a large decentralized thing, but they just have to not really be a DAO initially, whilst they just have quite a small set of contributors and are building it up. So there can be a variety of reasons there. I'd say there definitely is a bit of a mismatch between the number of DAOs and the number of DAO wrappers. There's far fewer DAO wrappers than there are DAOs. And I actually think maybe that's fine. There probably should be more wrappers than there currently are, just given the amounts of financial assets that can be in some DAOs and yet are unprotected. But, if a DAO wants to be completely naked and unwrapped, if it works for them, then so be it. It's a choice for the DAO. More broadly, though, I think if we take a step back, I think there's been a lot of hype and excitement on DAOs. It's part of that general Web3 urge towards the new, which sometimes is just hype, but other times is that kind of natural creativity and sense of innovation that I think you see in people in the sector. What that does mean, though, is people can sometimes uncritically adopt, they can ignore the lessons of the past and uncritically adopt certain, bad practices. So, as I mentioned earlier, I'm a history nerd. History and politics is my undergrad degree. I get the distinct sense of a lot of the DAO projects that have emerged over the the long while that people are just like, yeah, bro, one man, one vote. It'll be awesome. It'll be fine. It'll be decentralized radical democracy, which is cool. But there's a bit of a history of that. And lo and behold, bare majoritarian democracies where maybe some people hold all of the tokens, two guys hold all of the tokens and actually, the rest, the token holders. So it can lead to problems and that can lead to the collapse of projects. So I think we're still working as an industry and as a subsector, we're still working that kind of stuff out.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is the thing about DAOs as well, that you have this layer of transparency, right? But not everyone knows how to do the proper analysis of a DAO, right? Because you want to know who is owning the governance tokens. Are they all concentrated in one wallet or a few wallets, right? And that gives you kind of a clue of how transparent and how democratic is the DAO. So again, it's kind of interesting, again, from a history perspective, from a political perspective, to understand the importance of democracy in this case. And I feel like DAOs are championed by the idea of democracy, democratizing everything, decentralizing everything. And I think this is what's really driving the DAO industry. But then when it comes to SPVs, from a corporate perspective, like I feel like from an SPV perspective, it adds a lot of transparency and clarity in decision making. It globalizes access. So, instead of taking decisions behind boardrooms, you're actually enabling all the investors collectively to take votes individually without having to hire a proxy or be able, instead of having like minority shareholders with no voting power and then majority shareholders having vote power, everyone has their vote counted. So I feel like there's a lot of moving parts are happening with DAOs, but I still don't see the mass adoption that I expected it would have by 2025. And that's sometimes I ask, why is that? Is there an uncertainty on how effective these DAO wrappers are? Is that a reason? Have they been tested by courts in cases and controversies?
Well, yes. A good leading question there. I think, so there is fundamentally still a lot of uncertainty, right? There's been a few cases, but not very many. The Ooki DAO case is one of the ones that people refer to a lot, and that did highlight what goes wrong if you don't have a wrapper. In that particular case, a US court found the members of Ooki DAO that they breached a particular US Exchange Commodities Act, I think it was, and they decided that it was an unincorporated association, I think it was, and that each of them were all jointly, and each of the token holders were jointly and separately liable. Now, major drama. If you're one of those token holders who is possibly just minding your own business and happened to have a token sitting in the wallet and hadn't thought about it very much, catastrophe. So that's a really good use case for the DAOs. But on the flip side, actually, there isn't that much case law. Even the Cayman Islands, which I'd say is the big daddy of the jurisdictions as far as DAO wrapper goes, so far may change, but there isn't really much case law, in fact, any, I think, on the foundations and their use as DAOs. So there is this prevailing uncertainty, and I think that does stop some people. What I also think is we haven't really, as of yet, created too many standardized typologies, like there's the DAO wrapper, and that lends itself to certain things. But like, if you want to have a DAO for this purpose or that purpose or this purpose, there's the wrapper. But then there's like, there's your internal subgroups or committees, whatever you want to call them. There's questions around the quorum for voting. I think often a lot of that stuff possibly just insufficiently templatized. And that means people have to spend a lot of time thinking through what's going on, because you have to come back to that question, why do you want the DAO?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you bring up a very good point. And I like that you mentioned the Ooki DAO as an example, because that was in the U.S. jurisdiction, if I'm not mistaken. And the U.S. until now, they haven't really passed a regulation that unifies the different supervising authority boards. For example, the SEC is constantly into fights with the commodities commissions. They're always into fight with who has jurisdiction over what. So it hasn't been really unified. It hasn't been very clear. And so you're constantly in that struggle. Is it a security? Is it a commodity? What kind of token are you holding? What type of laws are violating? You might pass that it's not a security, but the commodity will tell you, well, it's actually a commodity. Or both of them will decide it's a commodity and a security and are being prosecuted by two different authorities. So this has been the issue in the US largely. And I think until they pass a federal level regulations for crypto, which Trump has promised that he would do that, still he hasn't done any of that. But if he comes through with that, then I think we're going to have more clarity in terms of DAO. I know that Wyoming has their own DAO LLC formation that is in place, but how does it apply across other states outside of Wyoming? That's still to be seen as well. When you're selling tokens as well, right? So you're protected. Let's say you set up in Wyoming, but you're domiciled in California. California is not going to recognize this as being operated out of Wyoming. If you're selling and marketing your products in California, you're crossing into that state.
Exactly.
So it becomes very confusing, right? But there's an alternative. The islands. We love the islands. You're from an island. So tell us about what's happening on the islands. Well, how are they taking a different approach here?
So yeah, well, I'd say the islands are taking a variety of approaches. That's part of one of the interesting things about these jurisdictions. So I'm as I mentioned, a bit of a history guy. It's interesting if you look at how the DAO SPV form has connected to pre-existing history of the offshore financial jurisdictions. So, for the last, 50 years or so, you've had a range of different, usually quite small jurisdictions, overwhelmingly, although not exclusively, islands. Gibraltar, as they always point out to you, for instance, is a peninsula. And Switzerland is very much not an island, sitting as it is in the middle of Europe.
These are a geographically locked island.
Yes, I suppose so. Yeah, it's an island of mountains. These are jurisdictions that specialize in providing specialized financial services and intermediation services. They are able to move more rapidly and more flexibly than large jurisdictions. If you're a jurisdiction of 60 million people or 600 million people, every law you need to change, you have to engage a vast amount of stakeholders. There's a lot going on in your parliament or assembly or whatever it might be. It just takes a long time. If you have 50,000 people, 500,000 people, 5 million people, you can move more quickly. And also you have to move more quickly because to survive in this world of big beasts, you have to do something special and make people come in. It's what happened with the trust industry. It's what happened with the funds industry. It's what happened with offshore corporations. Now it's happening again with DAOs. So what you've been seeing is smaller jurisdictions rapidly innovating, experimenting with various different forms of DAO wrappers, some of which are a adaptation of a pre-existing law. So for instance, the Cayman Islands Foundation and the Panama Foundation, again, Panama, another non-island. These are using pre-existing laws that took place before, the big spread of blockchain for DAOs, and then quite specialized things like, say, the Marshall Islands DAO LLC. In these cases, these are non-federal jurisdictions. They're not part of the US. They're not part of Europe. They have this independence, or in the case of, say, the Cayman Islands, semi-independence, as well as this history of being quite established financial services sectors. So it gives them, quite an interesting position.
Apart from the size and scale of these jurisdictions, do they have any other motivation on why? Because they're very, very pro DAO. Are there any underlying motivations why, their governments really want DAO investors to be there?
Honestly, it's survival for these places. This is the bread and butter for small islands. It's tourism and financial services. That's how they live. So staying on top of and providing value in the rapidly moving international scene is what they do, and this is a great example of it.
So a big question that here comes to mind. I like the Marshall Islands DAO. We are partners with my DAO team behind the Marshall Islands DAO, and I like all about it. A lot of things. You can set up a nonprofit DAO with zero tax implications. You can set up for-profit DAO, and then you can have a small percentage in taxes.
Low tax implications.
Very low tax, like 3%, if I'm not mistaken, to something percent, quite low. And they're looking to eradicate that as well. I know that they are in discussions with the regulators to make the program even more enticing for profit DAOs. And then you can create series DAOs, which in themselves are like SPVs to the DAO. So you can create mini projects that are wrapped and insulated from the main DAO activities. So there's a lot of flexibility there. The big question that I have had is, what if I am a US-based customer who wanted to, let's say, a DAO founder who wants to build a DAO in the Marshall Islands, or I'm a UK-based founder who wants to create it in the Marshall Islands? Would I be able to build it in the Marshall Islands and still operate in the UK? Would I be able to sell my tokens in the UK, or would I have to get an additional layer of regulatory approvals before I can do so? And let's assume it's a governance token. It's not a security token. It's not a commodity. It's not a real world asset token. Is just a very basic governance token. Well, how does the system currently looks like today in regards to these kind of cross-border transactions?
Well, I'd first, I'm afraid, have to sort of playfully critique your last statement. I feel a lot of the time we simply cannot assume these things. Something that is a governance token, wants to be a governance token, nevertheless may have some kind of value attached that could make it slide into being a security token without anyone wanting it to be initially. So I'd always recommend even just a very quick sniff test with a good lawyer on that point to any founder that's listening in. As for the wider element, yes, I mean, look, you can do these things. It just depends upon what you're trying to do and the consequences. And that in turn has a bit of a bearing. So if you have an international offshore vehicle, your home jurisdiction will have some views on that vehicle. How much assets are in it? How much revenue is going through it? Are you actually controlling it? Do you have mind and control over that vehicle? In the UK case, if you have mind and control over an offshore entity, but you're based in the UK, it's clear you're controlling it. The UK will decide that this is, in fact, as far as they're concerned, at any rate, a British entity and tax it accordingly. So you kind of need to think a little bit about that and whether or not you want that to happen. You may be totally fine with that happening. But if you don't want it to happen, how you can kind of structure things to have a bit of a gap. And that's where the question of which entities to use come in. And not every entity works for every jurisdiction. So for instance, the Panama Islands Foundation is seen as a pretty good wrapper. You see and hear of a lot of people from India seem to quite like it, particularly going through, advisors in the UAE. This is something I've come across quite a lot, and other jurisdictions too. But if you're in the UK, as a part of our network of advisors have pointed out, the UK will look at the Panama Foundation kind of like a trust, actually, rather than the Cayman Island Foundation, which they treat in a different way. And that has massive implications for your tax position. So yes, I think if I was to broadly summarize that, is it really varies quite a lot depending upon what you're building, where you want to build it, and who and what and where you are. And all of these things have to be thought through. So a little bit of tax and legal advice early on, even if only the most broad contours without getting deep into the nitty-gritty. I think it goes a long way.
Exactly. And this is a part that honestly, makes me think a lot about it, because we've done like a lot of offshore setups for entities with persons domiciled in the European Union. You have things as a foreign controlled company regulations, right? So like that's exactly what you're talking about. Typically, if you're conducting passive activities such as investing and you own more than 51%, you immediately fall into that categorization. And then the company's revenues are considered taxable on your actual jurisdiction of dismissal. But if you're conducting active business from that jurisdiction, meaning you have directors, you have economic substance in that jurisdiction, whether it's the Marshall Islands, Cayman Islands, then you can be exempted from considering yourself to be tax liable. I get that. But the part that confused me in particular in regards to DAOs, who controls the entity when you have a very democratized governance tokens? I might have founded the DAO, but I am not in control of the DAO. The DAO members are in control of the DAO. And now, do we need to start accounting for where does the majority of DAO token holders reside for us to decide where does the control belong? So this is, I think the modern problems that we deal with when it comes to DAOs. Like, how do these old antiquated regulations fit this new structure that doesn't really bind by the classical rules of company formations?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
very deep questions raised.
Very deep. I don't know the answers yet. I mean, I could definitely find out if I research it enough and compare specific jurisdictions. These are things sometimes I think about. But let's talk a little bit about Delaware. I mean, this is one area that I hear a lot of U.S. founders now are considering and started using, and they're moving away, and they're hoping for the Trump regulations to roll through that makes the rules clearer. What has been your experience with Delaware, and who do you think it's best fit for?
So Delaware, well, look, obviously Delaware's incredibly popular in general for non-DAO purposes, and like would say the Cayman Islands, I think there's an element if you're well known for one place, you can just become used in the DAO space. I've only had a couple of clients so far tell me of their interest in Delaware in connection to a DAO. I've spoken to quite a few US advisors. It's been interesting, right? Because in the sort of SPV formation and crypto legal LinkedIn world, that a very exciting niche for those of you guys who aren't plugged into that particular LinkedIn space. There's been a bit of a grand struggle being waged in blog posts and comment sections between foundations and US onshore formations. There was particular, I think it came out of Anderson Horowitz, potentially the first shot in this Titanic struggle. It came from Anderson Horowitz, and I think it was called The End of the Foundation Era. So I've been seeing a lot of advocating for US onshore formations, token issuance, and DAOs. Who knows? The majority of US advisors I speak to say that they're not advising DAOs and token issuance onshore as yet in the US. Nevertheless, I've spoken to a couple who are and are quite bullish about it. My broad sense is, whilst there is some very positive mood music from the Trump administration, thus far it remains largely mood music. There isn't that much flesh being put on the bones yet, is point one. Point two is, as before, you have the difference between the federal and the state regulation. But the state could be very pro-crypto. Federal will move longer. Point three, US midterms, what's going to happen? Will the electoral cycles here swing against crypto? And then point four, I think, is obviously there's a hell of a lot of Web3 people in the US, and that's great. It's expected. But not everyone is. A lot of your projects and token holders will be outside of the US. And it may well be, something to consider is if you set up in the US, you're necessarily pulling the project and possibly those individuals into a bit of a US regulatory nexus. And maybe that isn't ideal for what you want to do. So it's just something to bear in mind.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I tend to agree with that notion. I see the complexities in the US, but what really struck me from, DAO SPV specifically, your company, what you look at, I've seen Panama a lot. I've seen Cayman Foundation. These are two things that are mentioned. You've talked about them as well earlier, but maybe it's good to boil it down a little bit for our audience here. What is the key difference between the Panama Foundation, the Cayman Foundation from a legal standing perspective, legal nature, maybe governance, and of course, the most important for everyone is tax treatment?
Well, yes. Say ultimately, most of the things you want to achieve in both of those, you can. They're fairly similar. They're both foundations. A little bit of the underlying legal underpinning of the foundations is different, which is why I mentioned that thing about how the UK jurisdiction may view a Panama Foundation as a trust rather than as a company. But functionally speaking, you can get most of it done. So, you set up a foundation. You then have the directors or the foundation counselors, doing governance decisions and actually executing whatever takes place in the DAO. But the DAO remains up over here, and then you have the foundation that's acting kind of on behalf of the DAO in respect of it. A lot of the most important detail then comes in the bylaws, actually, and what you write into that bylaws, and that's what makes it quite flexible. I'd say probably more interesting comparison as far as foundations is concerned is not so much between Cayman Islands and Panama, but it's between those two and Switzerland, because you can distinguish on price. The Cayman Islands is a lot more expensive than Panama. Switzerland is really expensive as well.
The highest cost.
The highest cost. Well, I don't know. Frankly, hearing some of the fees that I know some of the larger white shoe firms have been charging for setting up Cayman foundations.
Yes. No. Cayman is crazy. Cayman, like when it comes to law firms in Cayman, I work with some of these big law firms. We both work with a common law firm. We've talked about it. We don't need to mention names, but their pricing is quite premium for any jurisdiction. They're premium for US, they're premium for the UK, so I see that. Yeah.
But I think it's that piece around the flexibility. So, particularly with the Cayman Islands Foundation, you can update the bylaws of the DAO Foundation as the DAO itself evolves. And that's particularly important because at an early stage, no matter how genuine your belief in decentralization, how lively your community, how innovative your practices, let's face it, you're probably going to have to deal with a small core of people who are driving it. And that means that the nature of the governance decisions that you make and how the operations are conducted, that will just have to change. So having that flexibility to change is quite important. And the Swiss Foundation, the feedback that the sector has had on this is that there just isn't as much of that flexibility. The Swiss Association, there's flexibility, but the foundations, no. I think the other thing to bear in mind, and I think we mentioned it perhaps a little bit earlier, is you have the world of the foundation structures. And in a sense, they're not fully wrapped DAOs, they're semi-wrapped DAOs. I envisage it a bit like a castle, which is open to the sky. A more wrapped DAO is one that fully encompasses all of the members of the DAO within the entity. If you hold a token, you are a member. And for that, I think potentially the Swiss Association is quite interesting. Also, indeed, the Marshall Islands DAO LLC and Wyoming. And I actually think that's almost like a bigger split. For each of these, then, remember now, as I come to the end of this quite extended point, you asked about tax. The tax thing really varies. It's all about where you are as a project lead, where your members are, and what the entity is in question. And one can't give a sort of neat answer. It's just something that has to be thought about in new circumstances.
Yeah, because the reason I asked about taxes is, typically in most countries, I know in Europe, you have treaties with other countries. Usually if you're taxed, as long as you're taxed at 15%, it's okay. You can have any foundation being set up in that country. If it dips below 15%, that's when the CFC rules comes in, the foreign controlled company rules. But usually that's the breaker, is that 15, any jurisdiction you're in dips below. So a zero tax jurisdiction always raise eyebrows for tax authorities wherever you're domiciled. But yeah, so like Switzerland then would probably be the safest bet, I would assume, from these. But again, Swiss tax is quite high compared to these 0% tax jurisdictions. Yeah, I like Swiss.
I'd say with these 0% tax jurisdictions, so the language that they very much use these days is, it's not no tax, low tax, or tax avoidance, is what they're saying. It's tax neutrality. And by that, they mean they're 0%, but everyone knows they're 0%. And also, due to all of the account information exchange laws that have been erected over the last, 15, 20 years, your home authorities can also technically see that you own the entity, see what you're doing with it, which means, nothing's being hidden. And because they tend actually not to have necessarily a lot of double taxation treaties in some of these jurisdictions, you'll have your 0% tax in the BVI, but your home jurisdiction will tax you whatever it feels it needs to tax you.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And this is the most common request that we get from potential customers and clients when they come to us. They're always trying to find a workaround because they have this old outdated perception that a lot of these offshore jurisdictions will give them full insulation from taxation. I'm like, you can get mitigation at best of your tax rates. You're not going to get complete. It's impossible, especially if you're living in specific countries. I would say EU, UK, US. There's no escaping taxation in these countries. The only way you could do it is if you actually move to a country that is tax free. Then you're good.
Yes, absolutely. I think you're right. People have this particular paradigm of the offshore world, which is sort of made in the 70s, 80s, petrodollar money floating around and sunglasses and Panama hats and things. But it's changed. It's changed a great deal.
Bearer shares as well. I get asked at least once a month about bearer shares if there's still a jurisdiction that has them. I'm like, nope, it's been a while since these have existed.
I mean, look, I do hear of people going to certain niche jurisdictions. My understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, I think Samoa, for instance, isn't in CRS and various other exchanges. I have someone did tell me they're sending people to issue tokens in Samoa, but again, for other partners, there might be a bit of a red flag. If you have your thing in a jurisdiction where there aren't these kind of quite standard treaties, what does that say about you and what you're doing? So
absolutely,
it might say nothing at all. But it's something to consider.
But you bring up a very excellent point, and I think this is a big consideration as well for founders that are listening to us today, that the choice of where you incorporate makes a huge difference in terms of the trust that you portray for your potential investors, for your ecosystem, and then again, for banking. It's another very important thing is you can go to a lot of shady jurisdictions if you want, but forget about being able to raise from institutional investors. Forget about being able to get banked, which is a big problem. So tell us, how do you handle that with your current DAO SPV, and when you work with clients, what is your key recommendations for them in order to get banked and in order to be able to attract the right institutions?
So it's a little jurisdiction specific. If you're from the EU, I will gently suggest to people that they might not want to consider Panama, for instance, because in the EU, whatever reason, Panama is just not looked upon well. So if you're then trying to get bank facilities or counterparties, and you had your wrapper in Panama, it might work, but it's just another kind of difficulty that you're putting to yourself. So maybe consider putting it somewhere else. Other jurisdictions don't seem to mind at all. So there's an element of like, who do you want to deal with? Who are you getting investors from? Who are your parties? What will they all think about where you formed? And then, yes, that comes into getting financial access to. As regards banking, if you want a straight up bank account, well, it's going to take a while. Wherever you are, it's going to take a while now. And what we also say is, we can assist with bank account facilitation, but we're not going to guarantee a bank account. Because at the end of the day, you have to make the bank feel happy with what you're telling them. And that isn't, we're not going to make any promises on that. Usually the better thing to do, or at least, what's good, what's bad, depends on your needs. A quicker thing to do, more optimal thing to do for most of these cases is if you want a fiat situation, it's going with, the likes of Wise or Revolut or, different international equivalents, they can set up the account, I should say, more swiftly, a matter of weeks rather than months, sometimes even less. And with different pricing.
And this is a very key point. It's like, the digital banks, you have to keep that in mind that the world is moving towards digital banking. And digital banking today, as the players you've mentioned, Wise, Revolut, are a lot more friendlier and easier to set up with. But then you have to make sure that they cover that jurisdiction you are trying to apply with.
Exactly.
So look at the banks in the jurisdictions that you're trying. If it's mostly traditional banks, be worried, I would say.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, and I mean, speaking of traditional finance, that's where I came from, TradFi and banking institutions. What are some of the biggest challenges that you think DAO founders face when they, want to get access to financial services?
Well, if you're unwrapped, if you don't have one of these wrapper entities, whether or not it's those sort of, full wrappers or semi-wrappers, that distinction we outlined earlier, then I mean, good luck. You're just, what is it you're saying when you go to a bank? You're just saying, hi, we're a collection of guys with tokens. The bank would be like, I don't understand. So I think the first hurdle typically is, considering that wrapper. Then as for broader financial services, investors, loans, partners, it comes down to the DAO. Now, I've spoken to, various people who say that they've had ongoing hurdles either as the DAO or, people who are external to the DAO and want to deal with DAOs because, you might come up with this particular really cool partnership deal, but then it has to go into the DAO. And then depending upon the internal laws of the DAO, rules of the DAO, the bylaws, and whether or not you've allowed any delegation of like certain partnership powers to like a small subgroup, you then suddenly are in this big conversation, all kinds of different stakeholders, varying levels of interest, varying levels of commitment, varying levels of knowledge about the particular thing that's being proposed. It's harder sometimes for partners to deal with that, because if they're with one particular form, it's just the CEO decides or the product manager decides whatever. Maybe it goes to the board. They decide the board is made of, 7 people versus 70 or 700, who might know nothing about what you're talking about. So again, it varies.
Yeah. And like, speaking of that, like, what is the biggest, I guess, comes risk when it comes to unwrap that they should be aware of?
Well, I think there's a lot. Who are the other members of your DAO? What are you doing? Where are you sending it to them? I think all DAOs need to think to some extent about KYC, whether or not they want it. And if they don't want it, what's the cost benefit side of that? That's for them to decide. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. What I keep seeing at the moment is this whole North Korean hacker thing. I don't know if you've come across this. So there's a lot of North Korean. There's a special division of the North Korean army that's now sort of getting tech software developer jobs all over the world.
Oh yeah.
How do there's this question of verifying who you're working with within your DAO, and it's an important one. And I think people are coming out various different ways of doing that. It's just something to bear in mind.
Yeah, we actually covered in a previous podcast about North Korean hackers and how they were like some of the top hackers. We had Jessica from Crystal, what is it called? Intelligence, right?
Crystal Intelligence, yeah.
Yes. Which is, so this is like on the rise apparently, and the prices are getting bigger and bigger. And so because the prices are getting bigger and bigger, the expectations from crypto forensic firms that bigger heists are on the horizon to come. So something to definitely look into. And if you don't have a wrapper, can you imagine what happens then if suddenly you lost everyone's money due to some bad policy? Even if you followed everything correctly, even if you crossed all the T's and have all the security measures in place, nobody's not bound to hack. BitPay got hacked for how much? Billions of dollars. You could have the best. Yeah, billions. You could have the best compliance team in place and you can still get hacked. And then if you don't have a wrapper, what happens then?
Yeah. Exactly. How are you insured? A wrapper will help with insurance, for instance.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And this is the beauty of capitalism is the LLC concept, the concept of limited liability companies. Go take the risks, but of course, be compliant, do the right things along the way. But if something goes bad, you're not personally liable. The company is. This is part of it. Well, James, thank you so much for actually being with us today. This has been really eye-opening. And again, unfortunately, we had some technical difficulties, but we overcame and were able to get really nice insights from your perspective. Maybe you can give our audience how they can reach out to you and tell them a little bit more about DAO SPV. So
yeah, absolutely. So we're here for all of your Web3 company formation needs. It could be DAOs, it could be protocols, it could be holding companies or operating companies, issuing a token, or increasingly, we've seen quite a lot in the last few months, setting up SPVs for real-world asset tokenization. You can reach us either at our website, which is daospv.com, Twitter, if you like, so just at DAOSPV, or on LinkedIn. You can find me, James Kingston, on LinkedIn, and so too of DAO SPV. Also Telegram as well, but what is my Telegram username? Forgotten it. Anyway, yes.
It's all right. You can yeah, exactly. Send it to me. I will put it on the description of this YouTube video so people will be able to see it. And if you're on the podcast, you'll also be able to see it. Just go to Spotify, look at the description of the video. But I mean, this was really insightful. And again, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Brilliant. My pleasure.